Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexei the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper.
How's it going, buddy?
Going well.
Good. So today we're talking about democratic socialism. And a few pieces came out back-to-back, 2 days back-to-back, both critiquing and asking questions about what democratic socialism is and whether it's a good idea for the left or the country to actually put its interest, energy, and political support behind these ideas. So, the problem here is that one critique asked the question, is democratic socialism a problem because it's too democratic? That would be Conor Friedersdorf in The Atlantic. And the next day, a piece came out by Sheri Berman, which basically asks, is democratic socialism democratic enough? Her title is Democratic Socialists Are Conquering the Left, but do they believe in democracy? And that's the one we're going to start with. So we'll take each one side by side, try to see the points they're making, and evaluate whether democratic socialism is too democratic, not democratic enough, or what the deal is and why people should think the arguments are legitimate or not that are posed. Okay? Does that sound good?
All right.
Let's
dig in.
So first, Sheri Berman. So I don't know what you thought, Ryan, but it seems like her piece does like a fine job of summarizing certain historical genealogies, if you will, of the left and the socialist left. She has a nice little paragraph that says as follows, quote, democratic socialism and social democracy originated in splits within the international socialist movement over how to deal with Marxism's failures. Central to Marxism was the belief that capitalism's internal contradictions would inevitably lead to its demise. By the late 19th century, however, rather than collapsing, capitalism was showing great resiliency. Fair enough. And so she goes in and talks about the different camps and then shifts wildly to applying that discussion to contemporary politics. And I think that's where the problem is in her piece.
Yeah, right. So it's a decently good summary of the kind of disputes between the Lenin, vanguardist wing of the socialist movement and the sort of Edward Bernstein reformist move within the socialist movement. The idea that you need to have a revolutionary event or a revolutionary minority where you overthrow the state and put in a new institution, or do you just sort of do like parliamentary democracy and like build up your kind of coalition and try to put through policy reforms that will sort of achieve the socialist objectives in that way? And that was a real debate, certainly back in the day, especially after the vanguardists won, in Russia and set up a kind of, dictatorship. I think what sounds very weird to modern ears, rather, is she says that the Leninist, like that tradition, is democratic socialist, and the Bernstein tradition is social democratic, and like, that is just not really, I mean, even in the time, that really wasn't the correct, I mean, first of all, the Leninist party was called a social democratic party up until like the middle of the revolution. And then it became a communist party. But also, like, they were just, as a descriptive matter, not Democrats. They were revolutionaries who, eschewed democratic, sort of parliamentary government to, take over a country as a minority group.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think descriptive is a good focus because it can get really confusing when we're talking about the terms people are using, especially out of historical context. And as we've talked about before, I mean, we have Bernie Sanders calls himself a socialist. It seems like he's a social democrat descriptively. So that can get muddled really quickly. But yeah, the taxonomy she presents is problematic, as evidently seen in her description of Joe Biden as a social democrat. So I think we can be we can be wary of the terms and their applications here.
But right. You have. I mean, she tries to tie, say that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and DSA are sort of part of this tradition that goes back to Lenin. And that's just like not at all true. And it also, as you say, describes a guy who is just like a hardcore neoliberal capitalist, Joe Biden, as being a social democrat. And that's just like preposterous. This is Senator credit card industry.
Absolutely.
Give me a break.
I mean, if anything, the Social Democrats want to save capitalism because they acknowledge the dangers of unfettered capitalism to democracy. And so I think that it's a really important distinction. While neoliberals and Social Democrats can both be seen as not radical in the sense that they want to save capitalism and maybe call themselves capitalists, the neoliberals think that the more the operation of the markets are given power apart from state regulation and apart from democratic processes, the better. And social democrats clearly think that's not the case. So I think we can say that apart from both of those, the democratic socialists actually want, so this gets to the crux of the question, actually want democratic processes to counterbalance the power of markets and business interests. So she doesn't get to that very quickly at all, and it's almost goes unaddressed until near the end.
Yeah, and I mean, it just, I think, kind of shows the relative uselessness of focusing on these sort of historical questions in trying to sort of outline the nature of today's current political formations. Like you look at an org chart of American left parties over the years, and there's been about 300 of them, just like sort of splitting and reforming and dying out and starting up. And, it's like you could sort of weave all the various internecine feuds that outlined all of those things. But at the end of the day, it's like not that important what they were, it's just like more like the kind of broad strokes picture, like stuff that people are calling for now, that I think is more, important.
That's the right focus. To borrow again from Wittgenstein, words are defined in context of their use, and the different uses have a family resemblance to each other, the same way that different family members have not identical looks, but very overlapping genetic similarities. So too, there are like contested words that have, resemblances in how they're used in different places, but the context is key. So let's focus on right now, what are DSA candidates? What is DSA pushing for? How, in the context of how our political economy and American Republic today, should they be considered? And what are they after, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, and especially when you're talking about this historical stuff, like no one in DSA is a vanguardist, or maybe there are some people who claim to be so, but there is no serious vanguardist movement that wants to overthrow the state, some small minority. And in fact, I think the entire idea of that being a viable way to achieve anything in a country like the United States has been comprehensively discredited. You can't, the way the Russian communists won power was by the state fell apart, like that was the key condition.
The proximate cause.
Yes, exactly. Like you cannot have a revolution in a country where the state has a decent grip on the military, and the United States government unquestionably has that. And as long as you don't have it, and Trotsky in his book about the revolution is absolutely clear about this. The way that they got the revolution to happen was, by basically the provisional government just throwing away hundreds of thousands of lives in the Eastern Front, making this attack that they were completely unprepared to make. The provisional government, attacking the Germans and the Austrians. Some of their battalions didn't even have any guns, and so there was a massive discontent among the army, and communist propagandists were in there saying, join up with us. The United States is nowhere near that sort of a situation, and so every meaningful socialist, a few completely powerless online people aside, is committed to formal democracy in some sense.
Absolutely.
You can't fight, the 101st Airborne. It's a silly idea. And
indeed, and even if you look at how a DSA meeting is run, it's very democratic in the sense of direct democracy as much as possible.
Yeah.
Incorporating as many voices into the process. And so, if how the actual organizations run themselves is indicative of their overall political philosophy, and that would certainly say.
That's again different from Lenin's idea of democratic centralism, where you have a vote theoretically on the party line and then everyone has to stick to it. DSA is not at all like that. It's much more of a big tent organization. You can believe all manner of stuff. And there are people who have, sort of party platforms within DSA, try to argue for this or that.
Yeah, lots of anarchists, a whole host of, you have some people that might even self-identify as more liberal or social democratic. It's a pretty big tent. And that, that might suggest there is this lack of vision. So this critique that she offers, democratic socialism's weaknesses lie, she writes, as Bernstein charged more than a century ago, in the abstractness of its vision and its lack of pragmatism. That's a funny charge given the other parties we have today and the neoliberals and the Democratic and Republican parties and what they're offering. What exactly are their visions? How pragmatic are they? What does that mean, right? It seems especially strange given that the very clear demands that, say, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez made in her primary run, vision, how about Medicare for all? How about, housing as a human right? How about climate change is needing to be addressed? All these issues that she ran on seem to be, if nothing else, extremely clear and very pragmatic. It depends what's meant by that. It's certainly pragmatic if it can get popular support and get implemented. And she kicked the crap out of her competitor, who's a 10-term incumbent. So I don't know. That charge of lack of vision and lack of pragmatism seems a strange charge.
Yeah, it's especially, you look at how most argumentation around putting forward various leftist proposals goes. The by far the commonest way to argue for something is to point to a other country that already has it. You look at Canada or the UK or Finland or Sweden or Norway or Austria or, and it'd be like their healthcare system is better than what we have. We should just follow in their footsteps and do a sort of, in a way that is much more pragmatic than something like Obamacare, which is
convoluted.
In a sense, a kind of utopian idea because, you like Switzerland's healthcare system is sort of superficially similar to that, but not only does it have a lot more aggressive cost controls and regulation of insurance companies in it, it's also that type of thing is not the sort of commonest way to go about, doing health insurance. And especially when you look at the type of programs that the United States government tends to be good at. It's like, does the United States government run really complicated things very well? Or is it better to just do big and simple, like Social Security? It's just a big building writing checks all day long. And yeah, it's just kind of like, what's it, in a strictly, process neutral sort of standard, by that standard, Medicare for all is much more pragmatic than Obamacare.
Absolutely.
It's, this we're talking about what works, what doesn't work. And so that, yeah, I mean, peculiar criticism, to say the least.
The funny thing about that is it's got to be a special use, talking about context and the meaning of words is their use, special use of vision and pragmatism here. Because, first of all, vision by definition is abstract, right?
Yeah.
If you're talking, I mean, that's the whole point of vision, is to be like a principle or an image or an ideal, something towards which you can then compare concrete specific particulars to see if it lives up to that ideal or that image. So first of all, it's strange to say that something, that a vision is abstract is a negative thing. That's part of what a vision is, in a sense. You can have, I guess, a concrete image, but it's got to be a broad thing. So to say that we want to help people, to say that we want the poor not to be poor, to say that we want to have people living and flourishing no matter where they come from. We want to, all these principles are part of a vision that is, sure, it's abstract, but that's good. And we can readily match that ideal with particulars and say, hey, does this fit into the vision or not? I mean, I think, funnily enough, every Fortune 500 company has a vision statement, probably, or a mission statement where this is the vision for the company, and are these policies fitting into our vision? So that's weird. But then pragmatism only makes sense here if what she means by pragmatism is small bore change, something that isn't really trying to do much. I think that's what because otherwise, as you say, Medicare for All is a lot more pragmatic and practical than the convoluted utopian ways that the health insurance and healthcare system are regulated in this country.
Yeah, and this is even more clear when you look at climate change. So what did pragmatic, capital P, pragmatic Democrats do with climate policy when they had big majorities in both houses of Congress in 2009 and 2010? Well, they tried to pass a really crappy cap and trade bill, which is sort of like Obamacare, in terms of like everything's going through markets. The objectives are not very stringent, what they're trying to do. And it ran into immediate opposition, and they gave up, and it didn't pass. Then, like 4 years later, I think the EPA finally got going on a regulatory response to climate change, which was sort of like force the power companies to make various types of reforms, to like cut the emissions over time and like boost up the solar energy. There's actually a bunch of green subsidies in the stimulus package as well. So it's like not nothing, but it was late and it was not very big. And this is, people talk about that as if it was pragmatic. But if you're looking at, take the example of like Pearl Harbor. After like we were attacked by the Japanese, Nazis declare war on the United States. The question then is not, how we're going to have to ramp up our tank production by 25% a year, and that's just unrealistic. Like we must respond in a very measured, careful, incremental way here. And are we sure we're getting our best cost benefit out of our aluminum here?
And that's another great point, because proper assessments of risk don't necessarily mean you do something small or incremental.
Yeah,
right? It depends. It depends. What it is to which you're responding and what that requires.
Yeah, and so with climate change, like if you looked at the science and you'd really digested that politically, what you do is the biggest thing you possibly can as quickly as you can. Do it now. Get those emissions down. Do it fast. Because like Miami is going to be 100 miles out to sea in 50 years, possibly.
That's right.
Like it's there's always uncertainty when you're talking about the future, but like the computer models and the science and all of that is fairly clear on this point. What we need is big and huge, and we need it yesterday. And
as Machiavelli wrote, there is a correlation between how soon you have the diagnosis and what the treatment options are. So the more foresight you have about what the problems are going to be, the more difficult the diagnosis, but the easier the remedy. You have lots of options. You can do any number of things. The later, and this is again could be a cancer diagnosis as the analogy. The later that you wait to properly diagnose and treat, the easier it is to see what's required, but the harder it is to actually treat. Well, I feel like the cancer is advancing pretty aggressively here, and we know what's needed, and we're still talking about really rinky-dinky options instead of aggressive treatment for things that we know need to be attacked.
Yeah. The thing, to go back to the war analogy, I was just stealing this from David Roberts, but you often hear, these sort of centrist people complaining about, are we really sure that climate change, is this going to be this bad? We need to have all of our ducks in a row with the science down to like 9 decimal places. And it's like, if the Nazis are marching on your city, you don't need to know the thread count of their uniforms to know that, like, what you need to do is fight as hard as you possibly can. Just mobilize every resource that you can get your hands on, and not fiddle around, making useless quibbles about stuff and wasting time.
Yes, each to her own weapons. It's to paraphrase a quote by Odysseus Elitis, Greek Nobel laureate of the 20th century. Each to her own weapons, and just fight, just go for it. That's absolutely right. I think the point here is that if pragmatism is properly evaluating risk and making decisions in response, the safer you are by not acting, the more that it's true that you should proceed carefully, slowly. But there is this. This is such a classically liberal problem. I mean, Carl Schmitt talked about famously in political theology how if liberals were deciding Christ or Barabbas, they would hold a meeting and try to figure it out. They would, have a whole set of procedures. They'd need to sit down and think through what to do, and there is a lot of truth there. There is this kind of epistemological skepticism that leads to perpetual processes and failure to have the courage of convictions to act when necessary. So again, that's a critique that I guess maybe the Democratic Socialists should embrace if that's what we mean by pragmatism.
Yeah, the left, the far left, the socialists in America and so forth are really the only ones who are pragmatic about climate change. Tom Perez just reversed the previous Democratic National Committee ban on taking donations from fossil fuel PACs, Political Action Committee, money.
It's just unbelievable. I mean, just how indefensible could that? What other possible reason could there be than a pernicious one for that? That's just amazing.
Yeah, it's straight up corruption. That's all it is, and it's every bit as big a threat to the future of world society, including the United States, as the science denialism in the Republican Party. You want to talk about pragmatism, what is that but just like a kind of mixture of soft, corruption and unpatriotic betrayal, just horrible.
No, it's so terrible that on the one hand, I understand part of what she says and others say, that there are some DSA members who are saying that even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are not true lefties. And there's some of that no true lefty stuff going on. And that gets lumped in with this attack on Democrats and this notion that, well, these Democratic Socialists, they don't see clearly that the Republican Party is really the danger to our country and to the globe. And really, they should just get on board and back the Democratic Party all the time. And that's just ridiculous, because if there's going to be a successful movement that addresses these problems, it has to be one that critiques the Democratic Party and critiques the contributions to corruption and lack of solutions for all these terrible crises that we're having to deal with.
Yeah. That's right. If not, not only because they, have been a only somewhat less eager participant in the political corruption of the neoliberal decades, also because they lost to Trump. Like, we gotta change something up here. Whatever we're doing, it's not working.
Yeah, and the other parallel I would draw there is that for the same reason that, yes, it matters what's going on all around the world, but being citizens of the United States, we have political obligations and political power to change our government and our policies, where other than our foreign policy that we enact globally, we don't have that same power or responsibility. I guess you could say we have responsibility as human beings, broadly speaking, but really the more proximate place where we can contest power and change things is in the United States. So similarly, lefties need to change the left-wing parties if you believe in electoral politics. So the Democratic Party is where most of the energy should be focused, because that's what we need to change and where we have the power to change, because it is the party that represents the left.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's a good spot to turn to Mr. Friedersdorf.
Sure. Before we do that, I want to just read one quote, and we can, take over these questions into his piece as well, because I think they come up in this broader question of what democratic socialism is.
Sure.
But just really briefly, if you don't mind, she writes, if democratic socialism is to revitalize the Democratic Party, it should have answers to the following questions, right? What does socialism actually mean? If abolishing capitalism is the goal, how are growth, efficiency, innovation to be achieved? And then she continues, is democracy, even when flawed, a means or an end? This is going to be relevant. Will democratic socialists prioritize democracy if the votes for a, quote, socialist future, unquote, do not materialize? Will they eschew the compromises and alliances necessary to protect democracy? So I think that's a good set of questions to kind of carry over as we talk about Conor's piece, don't you think?
Yeah.
Okay. So do you want to recap Conor's piece for us? It's called, let's see, he wrote, Democratic Socialism Threatens Minorities is the title. Nothing better protects victims of bigotry than a system where they can pursue their needs and wants outside the realm of popular control. What did you think of his overall piece here? What was he getting at?
Yeah, so I guess just to emphasize that this critique of socialism is the exact opposite one of what we've just been discussing over the last few minutes. He's worried that actually democracy is bad. Can be bad, basically kind of tying into the long American tradition, especially among conservatives and libertarians, of fear of mob rule and, expropriating rich people mainly. But in this case, he's worried about supposedly the danger to minorities. And so he quotes this Jacobin article, which is talking about basically economic democracy. And it says, quote, this democratization could be achieved through a number of concrete institutions, grassroots state planning agencies, workers' cooperatives, participatory boards. What is essential is that the people have real, not just formal, democratic control over society's wealth. And so from there, Conor spins out this nightmare dystopia of worker cooperatives who make he's sort of imagining Soviet-style planning agencies, which set production targets for every single commodity in the economy, and he's like, popular control is finally realized. So, how popular is Islam? How many Muslim prayer rugs would the democratic majority of workers vote to produce? How many Qurans? How many headscarves? How much halal meat would be slaughtered? And so on and so on.
This is an amazing vision of what he takes democratic socialism to want. It's something.
Yeah, and he counterposes this with a an alternative vision. He says, quote, under capitalism, the mere existence of buyers reliably gives rise to suppliers. And, so I guess just to start off here, there's a big missing piece of the equation, the existence of buyers. There's another necessary ingredient in order to be able to purchase
I can't figure out what it is. No. Wait. I'm a buyer. I show up. What do I need? I need something. I can't remember. What is it? Give me that TV. Just give me the TV. Why don't I just?
I'm a buyer.
I'm forgetting. I'm a buyer. You're a seller. I'm a buyer. What else do we need?
Yeah. And this may come as a shock to Conor, but sometimes there are people who don't have money. It's people, you might call them poor people. Capitalist societies have poor people in them. And if so buyers need money in order to...
that's what it is. I knew I was forgetting it.
Yeah, I know. It's just, this is some graduate level stuff here. But let's suppose we grant that people have money, that everybody's got some money, and you want to take your money and you want to go get something. Say you want to rent a house. Well, you could imagine a situation, as these Soviet planning boards were often like kind of incompetent at allocating stuff. You could also imagine a scenario in which a capitalist would not want to serve particular communities and use their control over the means of production to discriminate against people. So let's just look back into the distant past of 1973, when the first time Donald Trump was featured in the New York Times, reading from a Huffington Post story about this. His family's real estate company, Trump Management Corporation, was sued by the Justice Department for alleged racial discrimination. The case alleged that the Trump Management Corporation had discriminated against blacks who wished to rent apartments in Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island. The government charged the corporation with quoting different rental terms and conditions to blacks and whites and lying to blacks that apartments were not available, according to reports of the lawsuit. So here you have buyers, and they have money, but you're not getting the service through these great capitalist markets are dysfunctional because capitalists have a lot of power, and they are choosing, in this case, to this case was later settled, but I think it's almost has to be true that they were doing this, using their power to not service certain communities because they're racist.
This is a fascinating thing because as a libertarian, you would think that Conor would try to find a way to blame the states for this problem. Of course, he is advocating for the state to step in against the tyranny of the majority in economic situations that don't have to do with such discrimination. It's a weird thing. I'm curious if he believes, like Rand Paul did, at least back a number of years ago when he was interviewed by Rachel Maddow, I believe, where he wasn't a fan of that provision in the Civil Rights Act that applied to private businesses. He was fine with the government being regulated and not being allowed to discriminate on the basis of race. But capitalism and the invisible hand will really solve ultimately any problem that racist capitalists who own businesses who want to discriminate, they're going to be punished by the market, really. People will vote with their wallets and everything will be fine. I'm confused now. Does he want the government to step in or doesn't he? It seems like a little muddled political philosophy he has.
Yeah, I would guess that he would certainly be supportive of, civil rights legislation and sort of forcing Donald Trump to not discriminate in rental policy. But, this is a case in which, the government is having to step in to deal with the way in which capitalism allows wealthy people to grants them enormous power. If you're rich, you can get away with a lot. And
absolutely.
Yeah, so it makes an interesting contrast with someone like some of the more hard-edged libertarian philosophers like Hans Hermann Hoppe,
which is a great name, by the way. It's a
yeah,
great name.
yeah. He sounds like Peter Rabbit's sort of deranged cousin. Yeah, don't throw me into the briar patch of democracy. But for people who aren't aware, this guy, he's naturally, of course, he's a government employee. He's a professor. And he argues that democracy is bad because it doesn't allow people to discriminate enough. And if you have a libertarian utopia, you will be able to just discriminate to your heart's content and create these sort of apartheid communities, which he says is like, that's great. That's the form of the good, is living in like a company town where access to everything is defined, according to like racist suppositions of whoever owns everything.
It reminds me of, so Ira Katznelson is a political scientist, and he has this notion that businesses can be conceived of as private governments and authoritarian, tyrannical ones at that.
Yeah.
And this is certainly true insofar as their workers do not have any of the civil liberties that citizens of our country have with respect to the government. You can regulate whether, of course, depending on what the laws of the country are, as much as possible, these private authoritarian governments can tell you how long you have to eat, when you can go to the bathroom, what you can wear, what you can say. They can fire you at will, et cetera, et cetera. But also they have unilateral decisions making over their own resources. So it's authoritarian in the sense they have complete control of, what they do with their capital, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this, I think, very clarifying contrast between, in a country that has trillion-dollar companies like Apple, monopolies increasing across industries. These private governments collectively are controlling so much of the workday hours and what we can do with our time, and what products and resources we have, how much they cost, et cetera, et cetera. So this, however, seems to be Conor's vision of what freedom really is to give as much power to these private governments as possible. And that the real danger is that if you didn't have this strange system, you would have the people, the demos, right? In a democratic society is Kratos is rule and demos is people, rule by the people. That would produce, Islamophobic policies, that would produce no vegan milk. It's just, can we tease out how he gets from A to B, how he thinks that for some reason these authoritarian private governments and the profit motive lead to true freedom, but socialism, because it's really democratic, would not have the constraints of the market and would lead to this kind of Stalinist state. How does he get there? What's the argument, do you think?
Yeah, it's very strange because it's focused almost entirely on commodities. Like when people are talking about discrimination, they're usually talking about like, I can't get a job, I can't live in this place. The police are
harassing,
like shooting me.
Yes,
my community. Being thrown in prison on trumped up charges. That's your real kind. You're talking about discrimination. That's your like real hardcore discrimination. And this is just like, well, you want a prayer mat, and you can't go buy one at Workers R Us or whatever, because maybe the workers might not vote to produce enough of these, and so that's just like if like all commodity production is like subject to a majority vote, which is like, I think we can get into that a little bit later, but like that's sort of his dystopian vision. Everything's set by according to like direct democracy. then it could be the case, certainly not impossible under that sort of scenario, that, there wouldn't be, people wouldn't allocate enough hair products for African Americans, he says, or there wouldn't be enough sex toys or vegan milk.
Yes.
And that's kind
it's
of
very
the beginning and ending, because he doesn't say like.
It's so telling, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's so telling.
The pinched imagination here, like if Muslims had a shortage of prayer rugs in this country, that would be a massive improvement from their current status.
So first of all, it's a tremendous sign of the privilege operating here, right? That the conception of what oppression is, and then correspondingly what freedom is, has to do with whether you can buy a prayer rug. First, like the Islamic discrimination that is really pervasive is economic in that way. First of all, secondly, that lack of imagination really revolves around, and maybe also explains why a libertarian becomes libertarian, this conception of the good being a matter of what you can purchase and what you can sell, whether you can accumulate profit for yourself and whether you can buy and consume commodities, which is extremely narrow view of what life is, and also totally elides all those problems you talked about having to do with especially for people of color, especially for the poor, all kinds of problems relating to whether you can find work, whether you're fired, whether you're assaulted, whether you're harassed, any number of traumas and grievances that harm people that have very little to do with operating in a consumer market. So it at once shows a reductionist view of what freedom is and what tyranny is. Tyranny is not having enough Coca-Cola options or something, right? You want only 2 flavors of Coca-Cola? That's tyranny. I think that has to be born of the kind of privilege where you don't experience all these other traumas because you're in a privileged class, white male, doing well, successful, and so forth. I don't want to attribute too much to Conor specifically, but just the ideology overall is one that's so focused on these things that it must necessarily not have to worry about so many of the problems that operate in day-to-day life for so many people, that this is kind of like the problem that they want to engage with. What luxuries can I accumulate? Going back to the kind of the Lockean notion of what happiness is. So it's very telling.
Yeah, I think the pinched imagination is a good way of describing it. And Conor has written stuff about police abuses and government surveillance that I think are like more or less on point. So he's not completely blind to this sort of stuff. But when it comes to economic democracy, you just have this like this preposterous objection to it. To the idea that more democratic control over the economy might somehow harm vegan people. In a way, I think go ahead.
No, it's important that we point that out, just to not be unfair to Conor. He as a libertarian, of course, really focuses a lot of his writing on civil liberties. And it's interesting, though. I saw a tweet not that long ago from him about socialists are as bad, or socialists, like other groups, are not very good on civil liberties. Basically, only libertarians are really good on civil liberties. But when it comes to evaluating whether some democratic socialism is good for our democracy, it's a strange focus on economic issues, which kind of goes back to the genealogy of the political philosophy of libertarianism, which is to separate out economic issues from political ones. It's kind of its own thing. We can talk about the economy here, and then over here we can talk about civil liberties. And I think that's the problem, really.
Yes, I agree. And this maybe, I think Conor is clearly wrong about this. And like, who is most concerned about, warrantless surveillance and drone strikes and, police brutality and so forth? Like, it's the people in
It's the left.
Yeah, Congressional Progressive Caucus and stuff. Not everyone, but like that's where you find the people. You know, there's like that one guy from Michigan, was it Justin Amash? He's like the only Republican basically who's actually sticks to these sort of libertarian principles. But at any rate, so I think this is maybe a good point to like actually talk more concretely about Conor's objection here, about, you know, how the economy would be organized. And I think that, I mean, I'm not exactly sure what the Jacobin guys would say about this, but I think the majority tendency amongst socialists in this country would not say that you literally have to have a democratic vote about every single like commodity production decision. You know, people are generally not talking anything close to that level of fine-grained control over, you know, the production decisions. Instead, it's about like broad strokes harnessing of the means of production. And in particular, when it comes to markets, I would argue that the majority tendency is to say that not that markets need to go forever in every circumstance. You can't have any markets at all. It's instead to say markets have to be subordinated to the broader needs of society. And so insofar as markets are a decently good way of allocating things, you can let them stand, or like maybe you can have some like regulations here or there to prevent, you know, people being poisoned or whatever. But then in certain cases, you could say like, well, you know, markets in oil futures and in property rights for extracting coal and gas, like those got to go. Those are done. We're just going to delete them and run those companies out of business entirely.
Right.
And so, yeah, like in the sort of socialist vision of utopia, you know, to say like, all right, so we have a full-on welfare state blown out. There's basically no poverty. And, you know, you have mass unionization, you know, sectoral bargaining. So wages are really high, and, you know, people have a lot more money than they used to. And so, in that level, you know, like people will have a lot more capability to buy the things that they need than they currently do, in which, you know, there is a high poverty rate directly caused by the fact that capitalism in its raw state only gives out money to workers and owners of capital. And then, you know, you just say like, okay, you know, maybe we're going to like regulate certain things. Climate change is going to be a big one. But when you're talking about like some simple commodities like textiles and so forth, like, okay, you know, the workers making those things are going to be making a lot more than they did. You know, you're going to have overtime hours, no more sweatshop labor in the United States, at least. And,
yeah.
That's, you know,
that's the real objection. I think so. So it's unfortunate that he attacked a straw person, if you will, straw man, straw person, because there are trade-offs, and it's interesting to talk about the trade-offs, but what they're not are this, because it's not so much that you get the centralized committee and you vote on whether we should produce a prayer rug. Instead, it's supposed to be a democratic check, as you say, subordinating capitalism and markets to democratic control. And so if it turns out actually that, as you mentioned before, there are racist consequences to the way that the market is operating, then democracy, the people, will decide to say that's not okay anymore. Okay. And so, you know, if there are not enough prayer rugs because of Islamophobia, that might be something that socialists would want to address and say, okay, well, the market is not working out here. But more importantly, because of the things you mentioned on the collective bargaining, because I would hope that the socialists would push to ensure more leisure time, lower hours, more money for the masses, for everyone. Look, does Conor think that it requires a specialist capitalist mode of production in order to make a prayer rug? I imagine the millions and millions of Muslims that exist, some of them might want to make their own prayer rugs if they had the time and the ability to purchase their own. Like, we could go back to a time when there wasn't this hyper specialization division of labor where everyone is just, doing one little thing for 8 hours plus a day, right? And it's trying to actually undo that form of production so that there's more freedom and more possibilities that I think Conor is willing to imagine.
Yeah, and I think you would, in that situation, where people make a lot more money and they have a lot more free time, you would see people just doing that as sort of like, like that type of thing where you're trying to make something that has like a particular meaning for you or whatever, rather than just buying the cheapest.
It's this kind of amazing thing if you think about it. Actually, if people have money and if they have money and time, and their faith is so devout, but oh my God, if some like white male doesn't form a new corporation to produce prayer rugs, what am I going to do? I guess I have to give up on Islam. I mean, it's an unbelievable picture of what the human being will do, and then the creativity and the lack of creativity and the lack of will, like just to rely,
But then I think at the same time, you still would have a big market in.
Sure.
These sort of simple textiles and stuff. It would just be like, T-shirts are now. I think it would be the market would be rebalanced slightly, to where things cost more but they last longer. It wouldn't be so many people trapped in that situation as they are now buying like the cheapest thing. Right. It wears out really quickly, but you can't finance the more expensive kind and so on and so forth. But like
you wouldn't have the forced obsolescence. You wouldn't have 100,000 different varieties of something that you only need a few different options for. This goes back to the actual trade-offs are this. If you in your weird fetish want to have, 100,000 shoes or something like that, and socialism reduces your ability to kind of exploit labor in order to do that, a socialist society oriented to the common good might not think it's appropriate that you as an individual have to have, and maybe shoes is a bad example, more likely something where your desire as an individual is, say, harming the environment or some collective good or public good is being damaged by your individual desire. It's true that those individuals and those desires that go against the common good are going to be limited in a way, right?
Yeah, probably. And things which are clearly, what you would say in a market system like underpriced, like taking flights on an airplane. The price of that would have to go up a lot. But, I think also at the same time, it's important to emphasize, we're talking about democracy. We're talking about an ordinary, sort of democratic state. And of course, as part of that, whether you're talking about like putting this through under the American Constitution or like putting in a new constitution somewhere else, all this would, of course, have the strict Bill of Rights protecting every type of, individual identity, and, strong protections for religious practice and all that sort of stuff, just like read the South African Constitution. And at the same time, you spread out economic power, much more widely throughout the population. I think that those sorts of civil liberties protections will become much more meaningful and much more effective because, there's so much that a lot of civil liberties protections in this country, especially at the local level, are more or less a dead letter, because like the police will just, find some poor black person and just harass them illegally. And there's really, it's like, what are you going to do? Sue us? He's like, you don't have the money for that. Or even if they do catch the attention of the ACLU, it's like a long, expensive litigation and they're totally overmatched by the scale of the problem. Whereas if you make society much more equal and people have much more access to the type of, communities and importantly money that allows people to mount a defense against that sort of thing, Clearly it's not 100% effective, but it would be a lot more effective than what we have now, which is just like rampant, unconstitutional abuses of poor black people and transgender people, and every all the things we hear about every day.
No, that's right. That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
I think it's worth, as we wrap up here, I think it's worth pointing out that, in ancient Greece, the word democracy came from, like I said before, kratos, rule, demos, by the people. And there was this notion that in history, certain democracies turned into tyrannies because the passions of the people overcame them, and they weren't properly formed in their desires, and so that led to tyranny, essentially. And there's a cycle of regimes that Plato talks about. But then when Aristotle breaks down the different forms of government, he has not the usual breakdown, one, few, and many, which is, monarchy, oligarchy, or democracy. He has 6 forms, and there are 3 good and 3 bad, depending on the spirit of the people and the spirit of the regime. And there's this kind of isomorphism between the people and their desires and their constitution is and their character as human beings, and what that translates to in aggregate, right? So he called the bad forms tyranny, and right, for rule by one, with a person who's oriented to his own or her own good rather than the common good. The oligarchy, rule by the few, that's oriented to their own private interests, which usually is about money. And democracy is what he called the bad form, which was about rule by the many, rule by the poor, where the poor and the many were all oriented to their individual private interests. On the other side, however, you had monarchy, aristocracy, and what he could be translated into English as polity, the 3 good forms of each of those, where the common good in each instance is what was being served. There are different forms of government, but all were oriented towards the common good. And I think democratic socialism is like a polity, according to Aristotle, where although it's ruled by the many, the end to which that process and that form of government is oriented is toward the common good, where it's not just this aggregation of selfish individuals, which is actually what capitalism promotes. And so I can see, if you're a capitalist and a libertarian, if you combine, right, that profit motive, that selfish, individualistic, atomistic perspective with, right, rule by the many, I can see how you'd be afraid of tyranny. But that's a misunderstanding of socialism and how it's actually oriented to the collective and the common good. And you subordinate your private interests and put it within the context of what's good for everyone.
Yeah. And not in a utterly self-denying sense, of course. Everyone, you do have legitimate rights and expectations, but to say like we're embedding this in an overall framework that's supposed to protect everyone. It's not just like grab what you can.
Right. Yeah. It's agency and communion. The common good neither annihilates interest and the good of the individual, and does not subsume the individual completely. But it's neither an aggregation of simply individual interests. So it's a good, relation between self and other, I would think.
That's good. I think that's a good place to stop.
Good stuff, my friend. Thank you.
Okay. Wait, before we stop recording, do you want to should we record an intro real quick?
Sure.
I could just do. What do you think?
How should we do that?
Should we just say left anchor? Period. Should we just go with that? Stop trying to going around in circles. Yeah. So I could just do. I'll
sure.
Like introduce myself a little bit, and then
yeah,
and then you do yourself, and that's it. Sound good?
Okay. Sure. I'm trying to decide if I want to say my full name or if for tenure reasons I should just say my first name and say like should I mention where I teach? I'm just trying to figure out like
I could give you
how much information I should provide. What do you think?
Advice on that? I feel like it's. Do you think it would potentially hurt you or help you or?
Yeah, I have to just. Well, there's no. It would be all risk because I'm only evaluated for tenure on my teaching, my scholarship, and my service. But there's always, especially at a Christian university, things you can do that you can get fired for just because, or whether it's explicitly the case or not. I'm happy with taking the risk about my lefty politics, of course. That's fine.
I mean, if you're, if you I don't know. Think it's risky,
I'm
feel
fine
like
with.
You could.
I'm fine with it. I could.
You could call yourself Publius or something.
Yeah. Okay. I think if I just go by Alexios and then I'm a professor of political science probably people could Google Alexios professor of political science and find me, but whatever. I don't know.
All right.
Whatever.
Okay.
Let's just do it. It's fine.
Here we go. Hello and welcome to Left Anchor, a new podcast about politics, philosophy, ideology, and other things. My name is Ryan Cooper. I'm a national correspondent for The Week and freelance journalist to various places.
My name is Alexios Alexander. I teach political theory and American government courses at Eastern University. I'm an assistant professor of political science. And
all right, that should be
that's
good.
Who I am.
Hit stop.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I did it. I hit stop, I think. Wait, no.